This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Lisa Skinner on the show. She is a two-time best-selling author, and she is the author of a book that we're going to talk about today, which is a little different than our normal topics of leadership and technology, but it's something that's very important. I think it's going to hit close to home to a lot of our listeners, and it is Truth and Lies, Truth and Lies, Alzheimer's: Its Secret Faces, which is the book that she's most recently written. So with all that being said, Lisa, welcome to the show.
Oh, hi, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book.
Okay. So I've been doing this professionally for 30 years now, but my experience with Alzheimer's disease dates back 50 years.
Oh, wow.
With my grandmother. She lived just a few miles from our house, the house that I grew up in, and I, was raised with her and had a close relationship. So this one particular day, I wanted to go over and show off to her that I had gotten my driver's license. So I drove to her house for the very first time. She answered the door, let me in. Nothing really seemed unusual. We went into her living room to sit down and kind of have a catch up. And I hadn't been there 2 minutes. And out of her mouth, she started telling me about these birds that lived in her mattress, and they would come out at night and peck her face. And then she pointed to her walls and said, "Do you see that? Do you see that? Do you see that?" I said, "See what?" She said, "All those rats running around my house, running along the walls. They're everywhere. There's hundreds of them, and they're invading my house." I didn't say anything. Of course, I didn't. Any of these men that were constantly breaking into her home. They were stealing her jewelry and other personal possessions, and she's told me she was convinced that they eventually were going to harm her and take her house over. And I was sitting there just dumbstruck because I was raised in a traditional household. You don't contradict your elders. You don't argue with them. I mean, it's like, it's total respect. And I didn't know how to handle this. I had never, ever heard my grandmother tell such tall tales before, and I didn't know what to think of it. And as far as I knew, there was nothing wrong with her. And I even went as far as to leading her into her bedroom. And I say, "Grandma, I'm really interested in the birds that are living in your mattress. Can you show me where they're coming in and out of?" And I threw her covers off the bed and I pushed the mattress up and I said, "I'm just not seeing any holes or anything." And her response was brilliant for somebody who, as it turns out, was living with dementia. And I found this to be pretty consistently true now that I've, been working in that arena for 30 years. She looks me straight in the eye and she says, "Oh, Lisa, they're there. They're just very, very clever." And I have learned since that day that people living with dementia become very masterful at explaining away their false beliefs. I mean, she was absolutely convinced that these things were true. So anyway, long story short, I left shortly after that, went home, confronted my mother, and she basically admitted, she goes, oh, yeah, your grandmother's been diagnosed with what they called back then senile dementia, which in today's terminology is synonymous with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. And I said, Mom, why in the world didn't you warn me? Didn't you tell me? I said, I was just completely flabbergasted hearing these stories. I didn't even know there was anything wrong with Grandma. And her response, as it turns out, was very typical for the time. She said, because we're not going to talk about this. Just leave it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I have come to realize, helping thousands of families that I've helped over the last 30 years, that that is still kind of a typical mindset, because there are still today so many stigmas that are attached to this disease. And it's starting to change. I've noticed since COVID, people are becoming a little bit more open about it. But for the longest time, people didn't even want to admit that they had a loved one or caring for somebody that had a brain disease, because the signs and the symptoms and the behaviors are so peculiar as a result of the damage being done to the brain, that a lot of people relate that to their loved one being crazy, which is not the case. This is not mental illness. This is brain disease. The brain's being destroyed by these diseases. But, fast forward 50 years from that experience, and things really haven't changed that much. And this is really why I am so grateful to you for wanting to talk about this topic, because it's a very important topic that's going to impact so many of us. Since my grandmother, I actually have had 7 more family members that have developed one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common, but the World Health Organization and the Alzheimer's Association are telling us, really, red flag, this is coming, that unless a cure or a treatment is found by the year 2050, which is only 25 years away, the number of people expected to develop Alzheimer's disease in that time is going to triple worldwide. So think about that, how many families this is going to impact, and we're already impacted today. So, I really appreciate your support in us having this conversation to raise awareness, because many of your listeners, if they haven't already, could be touched by this disease and not really be aware of what their next step should be.
So let me ask you this: why is it increasing? Like, why are we seeing these numbers where it's tripling worldwide? In 20 years, and what causes Alzheimer's?
Well, one of the reasons why we're going to be seeing the numbers triple is if a cure or treatment is not found. Let me just preface it by saying that.
Right.
But as of today, as of this conversation, John, we're not even close to any treatment or cure. That could change overnight because, science is getting very sophisticated. But right now, there isn't one, unfortunately. But one of the reasons, there's several, but one of the reasons is because of our baby boomer population, which I'm one of. And we are the largest human population ever to exist. And we are reaching the age, some of us are beyond the age, the earliest baby boomers are in their 70s, to the youngest baby boomers in their mid-60s right now. And it's a huge population. So that explains part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other theories. Nobody knows definitively. This is going to answer the second part of your question. what actually causes Alzheimer's disease, but there are a lot of studies and scientific research that points to a variety of factors. And if any of these factors pertain to any one individual, what it's going to do, the more of these risk factors that apply to me, let's say, I'll use myself as an example, it's going to increase my risk of developing Alzheimer's disease starting at about the age of 65. And then for every 5 years after the age of 65. So by the time I'm 70, and then 75, and then 80, the risk increases about half. So for every 5 years after the age of 65, our risk increases considerably for developing Alzheimer's. And the more of these risk factors that apply to me, I'll say personally, the higher my risk is of actually developing. And I'll just give you a couple examples.
Okay.
5 of the family members that I just mentioned to you that have lived with Alzheimer's disease were blood relatives. The other 2 were through marriage. Like my mother-in-law was one of them. So I know that it's in my family. 5 blood relatives that have developed Alzheimer's. That's a risk factor. It's a non-modifiable risk factor. I can't change that. Does it mean I'm going to get it? No. It just means that it's one of the factors that increases my risk. Age is the number one non-modifiable factor. We can't change our age. We progress chronologically, and it's a risk factor. I can't change that.
Right.
Another non-modifiable risk factor that applies to me is I'm female. More females develop Alzheimer's disease than males. This is a fact. And so there's another strike against me. And then the 4th one that's non-modifiable is genetics. If it tends to run in your family, or if you carry a genetic gene that's called the APOE4 gene, and you can inherit from both your families. So if you have one of these APOE4 genes, you've inherited from one of your parents. But you can still inherit it from both parents and carry 2 of the APOE4 gene, which means that you're genetically disposed to develop Alzheimer's disease. Does it mean you're going to? No. It just means you're at a higher risk. So those are the 4 non-modifiable risk factors. And then there is a huge list of modifiable risk factors. And the reason why they call them modifiable is because all the ones that are on the list that we call modifiable can be treated or managed or changed. Okay. And the number one risk factor for the modifiable ones is having heart disease. So people out there...
Do we know why that is? Like, well, why does heart disease, affect your brain?
From inflammation. And that's one of the theories that inflammation, we carry inflammation throughout our entire bodies, including our brains. And there's been a correlation between inflammation and brain disease. So if somebody has high blood pressure, suffers from hypertension, but it's being managed, then that will almost negate that from being one of the risk factors that you're just going to add to the other ones that apply to you. Diabetes is a huge risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. And this one is kind of surprising, but it is, I just read an updated article about it this week. Sleep apnea is now being a direct correlation to developing Alzheimer's disease. But if you have it and you use a CPAP machine, then you're managing it, you're treating it. So these are a lot of the things that we know based on scientific research, on studies that have been done over the last 30, 40 years that all are pointing to, and one thing I should make mention of, John, is Alzheimer's disease is the most common brain disease that causes dementia. And when I say dementia, it's really that's synonymous with the symptoms that show up as a result of the damage being done by the brain, like my grandma having false beliefs and being paranoid. Those are all part of the disease. So Alzheimer's is the most common, the one that most of us have at least heard about, if not experienced within our own families. But there are actually over 200 known brain diseases that cause dementia. Wow. Some of them we've heard the names: Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's disease. But I couldn't tell you more than probably a handful of what these brain diseases are, but we do know there's over 200 existing ones that can cause this very similar symptoms from person to person that we see that display, like my grandmother, with my experience with my grandmother. First, the mattress.
So it sounds like a lot of the increased risk factors from Alzheimer's come from inflammation. Are there things that we can do that are proven to reduce inflammation, such as like cold plunges or sauna or something like that, that may reduce Alzheimer's or
inflammation is just one part of it. So lifestyle choices are a huge part of it, but it all ties into inflammation. They also believe that the inflammation causes these plaques and tangles to form in the brain, and they literally suffocate our brain cells. And each brain disease can show up differently in different people. But the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is first attacking and destroying our short-term memory, where Lewy body disease or frontotemporal lobe dementia attacks a different part of the brain. And the other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is people can also be experiencing what we call mixed dementia.
Okay.
In other words, they have more than one brain disease going on in their brains at the same time. They can have Alzheimer's disease and another one of these brain diseases happening simultaneously. So we kind of have a saying in this arena. If you've met one person with brain disease or Alzheimer's or dementia, however you want to coin the phrase, you've met one person with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, because everybody goes through the progression of the disease depending what the underlying cause is, and it could be several things, will progress through the stages of the disease differently. But all of these symptoms, and there's hundreds of them, we put into a category or a bucket that we refer to as dementia. So when I use the word dementia, I'm referring to symptomology. I'm referring to all the symptoms that show up, and they vary from person to person. But there's a lot of overlapping with the symptoms that you see with people living with Alzheimer's disease and the symptoms that you see in people living with Lewy body disease. Does that make sense?
It does. So dementia is a symptom that could be caused by Alzheimer's or other diseases.
You're exactly right on that. And that's confusing to people.
It is. Because I, before this conversation, I thought dementia and Alzheimer's were almost synonymous.
Well, Alzheimer's is actually the brain disease. Dementia is not a real disease. It's a syndrome that's made up of all of these symptoms that we see that are a result of the damage being done to the brain.
Gotcha.
Is that a little Okay. So back to the inflammation point. The foods we eat. So the worst foods that we know of that people can ingest, and I'm talking 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, it doesn't matter what age. The point is, and a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this when I was in my 20s, like, why should I worry about something that's going to happen in 50 years? I don't even know if it's going to happen. But we know now, and we didn't when I was that age, that the lifestyle choices that we make can make a huge difference in what happens to us when we're in our 60s or 70s or 80s. There's a huge correlation. So the point I'm trying to make here is making healthier lifestyle choices today, no matter what age or stage of life you're in, can actually make the difference between any one of us developing Alzheimer's disease or not developing it. There's no guarantee, but there's enough evidence that we can delay the onset of the disease or the progression of the disease by up to 40%, depending on the individual, by not eating ultra processed foods, for example. That's like the worst thing we can eat. And that causes inflammation. Plus, there's a lot of, unknown things in those kind of foods, the ultra processed foods like hot dogs and things like that. We don't know for sure how they make those and what's contained in them, but we know it's considered an ultra processed food, and those are the worst ones. And then the second worst foods we can eat are what's called processed foods. They're not quite as processed as ultra processed foods, but they go through a process. So they're changed when they're making the foods. And for those out there who this has caught your attention, the recommended diet choices is to follow something similar to a Mediterranean diet, which would include a lot of green leafy vegetables and more lean meats, fish, stay away from the simple carbohydrates like sugars and white bread. And our brains do not like sugar. We know that. And it causes inflammation. And then the other thing that we can do to minimize our risk or lower our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is continuously stimulate our brains. And by doing this, going to college, continuing education, learning a foreign language, learning a musical instrument, doing anything that makes your brain think. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you do this at a younger age is it builds what we call a cognitive reserve for your entire life. And that cognitive reserve ends up protecting you later on in life. So that's another healthy lifestyle choice. And then getting proper and regular exercise. And the old rule of no pain, no gain is out the window. That it's not applicable anymore. Probably one of the best things that any of us can do is to walk maybe 4 or 5 times a week. And that'll make a difference for all of us in minimizing our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But the list of the factors, the known factors that have definitely shown a correlation between our minimizing our risk or increasing our risk for developing Alzheimer's disease is pretty long. But the lifestyle choices involve what we put in our mouths. There is something said of the adage, you are what you eat. Getting exercise, cognitively stimulating your brain to keep those neurons firing. Think of your brain as a muscle. If people are into working out and lifting weights, some of us notice that when we don't do it for a time, our muscles kind of atrophy. That exact same thing happens to our brains. So we have to continue to work our brain muscle out so it doesn't atrophy. You should see pictures of people with Alzheimer's disease. Their brains have shrunk to about half the size of a normal sized brain. You can see it on, MRIs and things like that. It's really kind of sad. So one of the protective measures we can do is to stimulate our brains. One of the best things that we know that because of the parts of the brains that we use when we learn a foreign language to translate one language into another and vice versa, is to do that, or learn a musical instrument. It really works your brain. There's other things you can do, take classes and constantly learn, but just to, kind of veg out and not use our brains, we're increasing our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. So what should we do if we suspect someone may be suffering from dementia? And how do you approach the person, or how do you seek help? And what are some things that can be done?
This is another very complicated aspect of this whole disease because of the fact that, and I'll use my grandmother as an example. I didn't notice anything unusual about my grandmother right up until the day I went over to her house and she started telling me about the birds that lived in her mattress and the rats and so on and so forth. And this is true of so many people. People could actually have Alzheimer's disease ravaging through their brains for decades before any symptoms show up. And because the symptoms in the beginning stages of the disease are so subtle, a lot of times our attention isn't really drawn to it. And then, you might show up one day and all of a sudden your grandma starts telling you all these wild stories. And it's like, what? So the symptoms are very subtle in the beginning. And as a result of that, most people are not diagnosed with one of these brain diseases till they're already well into the mid stage of the disease. When the symptoms become so blatantly obvious that there's no question in your mind that there is something wrong with, your loved one. There is no definitive, as of today, there's no conclusive or definitive diagnosis for Alzheimer's. There is for some of the other brain diseases through testing. But what I will say, because this is going to, directly answer your question, if you notice that in your loved one, that the cognitive decline is happening more frequently, and the severity has become so noticeable that it's actually interfering with their daily activities of life, then that's when you really need to have them evaluated and see if there is a brain disease occurring in their brains. Because it could be, if it's just something as simple as, oh, I forgot where I put my keys, or where did I lay my glasses down?
I do that song.
Yeah, I do too. And most of us do, and that's nothing to worry about. It's called the normal aging forgetfulness process. And it can happen to, the older we get, probably the more we notice it, but it doesn't mean that something more serious is going on. when there's cause for alarm is when the symptoms show up that, they start repeating the things that their questions or their stories in the same conversation, and they just can't function the way they did when their brains were healthy, and they can't easily put a grocery list together or balance a checkbook. I don't know if people even do that anymore, but so just things that become obvious that they're really struggling with, just activities they've been doing in their life for decades. And all of a sudden, these things become very difficult. And this is unfortunate because we know through scientific research and a variety of other measures that the earlier the disease is detected, the more chance we have of helping delay the progression of the disease, or can't stop it. You can't reverse it, but early detection, we know, is crucial for Alzheimer's disease, but we don't yet have a way to distinguish between normal aging forgetfulness signs. And then there's another category that we call mild cognitive impairment, which is just a little more severe, and these, memory issues and things that we notice happen a little bit more frequently, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that it's being caused by one of these brain diseases. And then there's your full-blown dementia. And if it's full-blown dementia, that means that you have one of these brain diseases, and it's a progressive degenerative disease that will progress through the stages until the very end, and there's really no looking back. So
there's no proving this point.
So we still have a long way to go with trying to get all this figured out, to be able to diagnose people in the earlier stages versus the mid stages, and recognize signs earlier, and be able to have tools to determine if this is truly one of these diseases. Because as I said, well, like today, Alzheimer's disease, you cannot conclusively or definitively diagnose it yet. We don't have the means to do that. So what the doctors will do is they will test people and eliminate what it's not, and then draw a conclusion based on what it's not showing up to be, that, oh, well, okay, I've eliminated everything else, so my professional opinion is you have Alzheimer's disease. But
Gotcha.
yeah. So it makes living with this disease, and for, everybody involved, people who have it, the family members, the caregivers, it makes our world just a lot more complicated because of the things that we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, what can we do to help, and how can people connect with you online if they want to learn more?
Well, probably the best resource to go to is my website, which is www.mindingdementia.com. And my best advice to anybody who's listening to your show today, John, is if this disease has touched your family, or if it does touch your family, and this is based on 30 years of experience working with families, because it's a very, very complex disease, and a lot of people aren't really aware of that. Most people think it just robs you of your memory and causes confusion. It's so much more complicated than that, as I illustrated with, my conversation with my grandmother. Learn as much as you can about what to expect on a day-to-day basis. Because the behaviors are unpredictable. You never know what's going to come out of somebody's mouth. You never know how they're going to behave in any situation. And the more you know, the more prepared you will be for a time when you might go over to your grandma's house and hear about birds living in their mattress and pecking at their face.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you bringing this to our attention and enlightening us on what we can expect and what we can learn. And again, really appreciate it. And I'll link your book and your website up to the show in our show notes at geekleader.com, so people can go there and click through. And again, thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate you.
Thanks again for having me, John. I appreciate you too.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.